January 1944. The monsoon clouds hung low over the Irrawaddy hills of Burma, heavy, gray, unbroken beneath them. A dirt airstrip shimmered with pools of rainwater and the smell of aviation fuel. Mechanics, stripped to the waist, worked knee-deep in mud, tightening bolts under the swollen belly of an aircraft once thought obsolete, the Hawker Hurricane. Its wings bore faded roundels, its metal skin patched with field repairs and tropical rust, yet the sound it made, that deep, confident hum of the Merlin engine, still carried the echo of 1940. The same roar that had once saved Britain now returned to a very different sky. From the jungles beyond the strip came the muffled thump of Japanese mortar. The war in the east was grinding, suffocating, personal here. Hurricanes no longer chased Messerschmitts over the channel. They dived through monsoon rain, hunting trucks, bridges, and columns of men in the green labyrinth below. This was not glory, it was redemption, a quiet, forgotten revenge, fought thousands of miles from home. And it began when the hurricanes rose again. When 1942 dawned, Britain's empire was in retreat, the fall of Singapore in February. Struck like thunder through the corridors of Whitehall, the Royal Air Force. Stretched thin across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Could offer little to the collapsing Eastern defense's Japanese air power, nimble, aggressive and unrelenting, dominated the skies from Rangoon to Rabaul. In that chaos, the Hawker Hurricane, once the champion of the Battle of Britain, seemed a relic newer aircraft. Spitfires and Mosquitoes drew the headlines and the factory output. The Hurricane, rugged but outclassed in Europe, was quietly reassigned to secondary theaters. That phrase, secondary, would soon take on a bitter irony. As Japanese forces surged through Burma and towards India, Allied commanders realized the need for any aircraft that could take off from primitive strips, absorb punishment, and deliver firepower at low altitude. The Hurricane, though slower and heavier than the Zero, had something the sleeker fighters did not: resilience. Its wide undercarriage handled rough ground. Its solid frame shrugged off tropical abuse. By mid-1942, entire squadrons were diverted east RAF No. 17, 2028, and 113 squadrons packed up from the Middle East and arrived in India. The men found themselves in a different world, a war of heat, humidity, disease, and loneliness. Airfields were little more than stretches of clay and grass carved out of jungle. Their enemy appeared from nowhere, struck fast and vanished into the clouds. At first, the Hurricanes fought uphill battles. The Japanese Ki-43 Oscar outturned them with ease, and the A-6M0 could climb and dive with deadly grace. Pilots trained for the Channel found their tactics useless in the East. Losses were heavy. Morale brittle. We felt forgotten. One pilot later recalled, "It was as though the world had moved on from us, and we from it." But necessity breeds adaptation. British and Commonwealth flyers, joined by Indian and Burmese volunteers, began to relearn air combat. They fought in pairs, diving hard to exploit the Hurricane's superior dive speed. They upgraded their guns, mounted bomb racks, and carried new rockets. What began as a desperate defense slowly turned into a doctrine of close support and ground attack. The transformation wasn't immediate. It was earned through attrition, repair, and stubbornness. The jungles of Burma became laboratories of improvisation, bamboo huts for workshops, palm leaves for camouflage, and mud-filled drums for makeshift refueling stations. The Hurricane became a soldier's aircraft, rough, loyal, and deadly when used right. Behind the front lines, the political stakes grew sharper. The Japanese advance toward India threatened not just territory but imperial prestige. For the first time since the Napoleonic Wars, British land seemed exposed in Delhi and Calcutta. Civilians dug air raid trenches. In London, Churchill demanded a counter-offensive that the exhausted Eastern Command could scarcely mount. And so the order was given: reconstitute the RAF in the East. Whatever it takes: reinforcements, training cadres, and entire shipments of spare parts were routed through the Indian Ocean convoys. Airfields in Impal, Chittagong, and Agartala expanded overnight. Among the first arrivals rolled the familiar shapes of the Hurricane MKIIBs and MKIICs, their propellers coated in salt, their guns wrapped in oiled canvas, their pilots gaunt from months of transit. They came not as symbols of triumph but of endurance. The aircraft that had once defended Britain's skies now faced a harsher test to reclaim a forgotten frontier. And in the months ahead, their persistence would turn from survival to retaliation. The monsoon was ending, the ground was firming, the war in the East was about to change. By mid-1943, the RAF in India and Burma had begun to reorganize Hurricanes. Alongside a growing number of P-40 Kittyhawks and Beaufighters, formed the backbone of the Eastern Air Defense. Commanders faced a unique challenge. Jungle warfare demanded close coordination with ground forces. Yet terrain and monsoon rains often made communications impossible. Airfields were carved from soil, and every landing strip risked being swallowed by mud within hours. Number 17 Squadron, stationed near Impal, became the first unit to test new operational doctrines. Pilots flew reconnaissance missions at dawn, skimming the dense canopy to identify Japanese supply routes. Hurricanes, once purely fighters, were equipped with bombs and rockets for low-altitude strikes. Dive bombing and strafing runs became standard, exploiting the Hurricane's durability rather than its speed. The enemy, however, was adaptive. Japanese reconnaissance planes flew high and fast, while ground units ambushed airstrips with mortar and machine guns. Hurricanes had to arrive suddenly, strike quickly, and withdraw before retaliatory fire could mount. Pilots learned to read the jungle. The shape of treetops betrayed hidden artillery. Smoke trails revealed fuel depots. Every sortie was a lesson in improvisation. Logistics strained every element of the campaign. Fuel, spare parts, and ammunition had to travel thousands of miles. Through submarine-threatened convoys, engines were cannibalized to keep frontline aircraft flying. Maintenance crews, often operating in open-air workshops, battled heat, humidity, and disease as persistently as they battled mechanical failure. Yet, despite these obstacles, Hurricanes kept the skies over the Irrawaddy and later over northern Burma active, a symbol of continuity and resilience. Allied intelligence began to recognize a subtle but growing shift. Japanese columns, once bold and unimpeded, now hesitated under the threat of low-flying Hurricanes. Reports filtered back of fuel depots destroyed, river crossings bombed, and supply trucks left abandoned along jungle roads. The forgotten front was waking to its own counterattack. Meanwhile, leadership adapted to the realities of jungle warfare. Air Vice Marshal Sir Richard Pearce and group commanders coordinated closely with General William Slim's 14th Army. RAF Hurricanes were tasked with supporting infantry advances, disrupting supply lines, and softening defensive positions ahead of river crossings and hill assaults. The integration of air and ground operations, a difficult feat in Europe, became a hallmark of the Eastern Theater. The pilots themselves carried the memory of earlier campaigns with them. Many had flown over Britain in 1940, dogfighting Messerschmitts over open fields. Now they flew over dense green jungles, often in isolation. With no fighter cover and no guarantee of immediate rescue, their courage was matched by ingenuity. Makeshift runway lights, improvised armor, and stripped-down weapon loadouts became the norm. The Hurricane had become both shield and sword. By late 1943, the first notable successes began to emerge. Hurricanes strafed Japanese supply convoys along the Irrawaddy. River bridges critical to enemy movements were destroyed. Isolated posts, once untouchable from the air, became vulnerable to precision strikes. The narrative was changing. The Hurricanes were no longer a defensive relic. They were a forward-moving instrument of attrition and retribution. The stage was set for a turning point. The RAF in the East had rebuilt, learned, and adapted Hurricanes, once considered outdated, now returned as relentless instruments of survival and vengeance. Their pilots were hardened by months of adversity. Mechanics had mastered repair in extreme conditions, and the Allied command structure had finally synchronized air and ground operations in the most inhospitable theater of the war. As 1944 approached, a new campaign was on the horizon, one that would allow the Hurricanes to strike decisively and reclaim the skies. Above Burma, their moment of revenge was no longer a hope. It was imminent. The men behind the controls were more than pilots. They were survivors of two wars. Many had faced the Blitz, the chaos of 1940, the loss of friends over the Channel. Now they were thousands of miles from home, flying over dense jungle with heat and humidity as lethal as any enemy. Squadron life in Burma demanded endurance and creativity. Pilots lived in bamboo huts or under tarpaulins, exposed to monsoon rains that turned the ground into a quagmire. Malaria, dysentery, and heat exhaustion were constant companions, yet these men carried out sorties daily, navigating thick clouds and low visibility, hunting Japanese convoys and supply points. Letters home were scarce. The war in the East was considered secondary by much of Britain, yet for the men in Hurricanes, every destroyed truck, every bombed bridge was a measure of survival and defiance. The emotional weight of responsibility was immense. A single miscalculation could cost lives on both sides. Pilots formed tight bonds with their gunners and mechanics, recognizing that in this isolated theater, human trust was as critical as the aircraft itself. One pilot described the feeling of flying over the Irrawaddy at dawn. The jungle stretched endlessly beneath us, green and silent, until you saw smoke curling from a column of trucks. That was when the fear and the purpose merged. You had to act, or the moment would be lost. Here, human resilience defined the Hurricane's effectiveness, proving that technology alone could not win the air war in the East. The Eastern theater demanded tactics drastically different from European. Air battles. Hurricanes were slower and less maneuverable than the Japanese P-43 or a 6M0, which forced Allied pilots to innovate. Dogfighting, as in Europe, was often suicidal. Instead, Hurricanes excelled at low-altitude strikes, diving attacks, and hit-and-run sorties. Close air support became a central doctrine. Pilots learned to coordinate with infantry units, timing strafing runs to weaken defensive positions before a ground assault. Rivers, bridges, and supply routes became primary targets, as disrupting logistics could slow Japanese advances more effectively than shooting down enemy planes. Squadron leaders also emphasized teamwork in the air. Formation flying minimized losses and maximized firepower during attacks. Reconnaissance was often combined with attack runs. A single sortie might involve spotting enemy trucks, marking targets with smoke, and returning for a follow-up bombing run. Precision, speed, and timing were the keys to survival. Airfields themselves became tactical chessboards. Pilots had to anticipate enemy reconnaissance and adjust departure times to avoid ambushes. Hurricanes' resilience allowed them to operate from rough strips, giving commanders flexibility to strike unexpected targets deep in Japanese territory. Each engagement was a test of judgment, coordination, and adaptation, a far cry from the dogfights over the English Channel. The Hurricane in the East was not the same aircraft that fought over Britain in 1940. By 1943-44, the MKIIB and MKIIC variants had been adapted for tropical warfare and ground attack. Cannons replaced some of the older machine guns, and bombs or rockets could be mounted on wing pylons, turning the fighter into a potent multi-role platform. Airframe modifications addressed the extreme conditions. Oil coolers and filters were adjusted to handle heat and humidity. Rugged landing gear allowed operations from soil-packed jungle strips, where every takeoff or landing tested the aircraft's durability. Hurricanes could sustain damage that would down lighter fighters. giving pilots confidence during risky strafing or dive-bombing missions. Mechanics became instrumental in adapting the machines. Field repairs were conducted with improvised tools. Using spare parts cannibalized from damaged planes, canvas covers protected instruments from monsoon rain. While jungle camouflage reduced the likelihood of preemptive Japanese attacks, the aircraft's versatility turned a necessity into innovation, a hallmark of the RAF's campaign in the East. The combination of airframe resilience, heavy armament, and adaptability allowed the Hurricane to function in ways its designers had never envisioned, no longer just a fighter. It became a symbol of improvisation and relentless pressure, capable of altering the battlefield from the skies above the jungle. Leadership in the Eastern Theater required a blend of strategic vision and on-the-ground adaptability. Air Vice Marshal Sir Richard Pearce, along with group and squadron commanders, faced the challenge of coordinating air power across vast, difficult terrain. Unlike Europe, where dense air defense networks existed, Burma offered jungle expanses, rivers, and mountains that complicated reconnaissance and support operations. Commanders emphasized integration with General William Slim's 14th Army, prioritizing close air support for infantry operations. Orders were precise but flexible, allowing pilots to exploit opportunities as they appeared. The decision to redeploy Hurricanes, previously considered obsolete, reflected a pragmatic understanding of their strengths. Leadership recognized that durability and ground attack capability mattered more than speed or maneuverability against the Japanese. On the squadron level, leaders nurtured resilience and initiative. Flight commanders often flew alongside junior pilots, providing real-time guidance during hazardous missions. Decisions made in minutes, whether to abort a strike, adjust formation, or redistribute firepower, could determine survival. Strong leadership not only preserved lives but transformed the Hurricanes from outdated fighters into an effective offensive force, capable of shaping the battle across Burma. The Japanese Imperial Army and its air forces presented a unique challenge. Skilled pilots, flying Ki-43, Oscars, and Nakajima Ki-27s, excelled at agile dogfighting, often outmaneuvering slower Hurricanes in mid-air engagements on the ground. Japanese logistics relied on narrow jungle tracks, rivers, and makeshift bridges, making convoys vulnerable to low-level strikes. Yet the Japanese were adaptive. They employed camouflage, deception, and surprise attacks to counter Allied air power mortar and anti-aircraft. Guns lined known airfields and supply routes. Despite these defenses, Hurricanes exploited weaknesses in speed, firepower, and operational reach by striking quickly and unpredictably. RAF units forced the enemy to abandon key positions and adjust supply chains. The dynamic between Allied aircraft and Japanese units evolved into a battle of adaptation. Hurricanes were not just confronting aircraft. They were disrupting the enemy's entire operational ecosystem. Every destroyed convoy or bombed bridge translated into fewer supplies, delayed reinforcements, and reduced combat effectiveness. The RAF's air campaign became an invisible hand, shaping Japanese movements long before ground forces engaged. The Hurricanes campaign in the East carries a layered moral significance. On one level, it was about survival, reclaiming lost ground, and halting an advancing army. On another, it represented a quiet form of revenge for the earlier defeats and retreats, a vindication of men and machines often overlooked by history. Historians note that the Burma campaign, though secondary in public consciousness, shaped Allied strategy in Southeast Asia. The return of the Hurricanes symbolized resilience and ingenuity, proving that outdated technology, when used creatively and decisively, could still alter outcomes. It challenges conventional narratives that focus solely on Europe or the Pacific, highlighting the interconnectedness of global warfare. For the pilots and crews, the campaign also carried profound personal stakes. Each mission embodied a confrontation with fear, fatigue, and isolation. Success was measured not in headlines, but in lives preserved and objectives achieved. Their legacy is one of perseverance, a reminder that valor is not always dramatic, but often silent, methodical, and enduring. February 1944. The skies above the Iraqan coast carried the promise of change. The monsoon had just receded, leaving mud-drenched airstrips firm enough for takeoffs. Hurricanes lined the field, their Merlin engines throbbing like living beasts, ready to unleash months of preparation in a single orchestrated campaign. The first major operation unfolded near the Caledon River. Japanese forces had consolidated along the riverbank. Using narrow crossings to funnel supplies northward, intelligence had pinpointed these choke points: bridges, fuel depots, and supply columns. Hurricanes of number 17 and number 20. Squadrons prepared for coordinated attacks, dive bombing runs followed by low-level strafing. Pilots checked weapons and bomb racks obsessively. Mechanics wiped the last traces of mud from the undercarriage, knowing the plane's durability would be tested to its limit. At 0730 hours, the first Hurricanes climbed into a pale morning sky. Their objective was surgical: destroy the bridge at Nyong Bins before enemy reinforcements could arrive. The first dive brought engines screaming, wings trembling under heavy payloads. Bombs struck with devastating precision, shattering the bridge spans and sending wooden debris into the river below. Japanese defenders scrambled, their anti-aircraft fire lashing at the retreating aircraft. A second wave descended, strafing trucks and ammunition dumps. Pilots described the chaos below as a living maze of fire and smoke. Hurricanes, despite their slower speed compared to Japanese fighters, relied on altitude, timing, and dive momentum to evade retaliation. Each pilot understood that hesitation could mean death, but the risks were necessary to choke the enemy's supply lines. Meanwhile, coordination with ground forces amplified the effect. Infantry units advanced under the protective shadow of air superiority, seizing villages previously thought unreachable. The synchronized pressure from above and below forced Japanese troops into hurried retreats, abandoning equipment and stores. The success of the Caledon operation marked a turning point in tactical doctrine. Hurricanes were no longer merely defensive or auxiliary. They were decisive instruments of attrition and disruption. Commanders observed the transformation in real time. Air Vice Marshal Pierce noted in a report, "The Hurricane strikes have, in several instances, broken enemy supply chains before they could be fully established. Their contribution to the ground advance is increasingly critical." Yet the campaign was far from over. The enemy learned quickly. Dispersing convoys and concealing bridges under jungle canopy, Hurricanes adapted, flying reconnaissance, marking targets, and coordinating follow-up attacks. The pace of operations intensified. Multiple sorties per day became standard. Fuel consumption, engine wear, and pilot fatigue were constant concerns. Every success demanded meticulous planning, precise execution, and relentless endurance. By March 1944, the campaign extended to the northern reaches of Burma. The Japanese had fortified positions along the Irrawaddy River, anticipating repeated aerial attacks. Hurricanes, now seasoned by months of low-level operations, became the spearhead for a series of daring strikes. Pilots flew in pairs, sometimes 3 or 4 at a time, executing dive bombing and strafing runs that disrupted supply depots, ammunition dumps, and troop concentrations. Each sortie further weakened Japanese operational capacity, turning months of defensive attrition into coordinated, offensive pressure. Casualties among Hurricanes were significant, but so was the psychological impact. Japanese troops began to fear the low hum of Merlin engines before they saw the aircraft convoys slowed. Bridges were abandoned, and jungle encampments were left empty for the first time. Months of hardship and preparation yielded not just survival, but the sense of control. the first taste of the revenge that had been brewing since the hurricane's arrival. The success in the Irrawaddy set the stage for larger operations. Forward airfields became hubs of activity, stretching supply lines but enabling deeper penetrations. Coordination with Slin's 14th Army was tighter than ever. Linking airstrikes directly to infantry objectives, the pace of the campaign was accelerating. And Hurricanes had proven their resilience, versatility, and impact under extreme conditions. By the end of Part 1 of the climax, the RAF in Burma had achieved its first tangible reversal of fortune. Hurricanes, once deemed obsolete, were now indispensable. Their sorties had disrupted supply lines, destroyed critical infrastructure, and lifted morale among Allied ground forces. Yet the ultimate turning point, the decisive strike that would fully tip the balance, was still ahead, waiting to transform months of calculated pressure into a singular, unforgettable blow. April 1944. The dense jungles north of the Irrawaddy had long concealed Japanese supply lines, fortified encampments, and hidden artillery positions. Intelligence indicated that the enemy planned a major counteroffensive against advancing Allied columns. The opportunity and necessity for a decisive aerial strike was clear. Hurricanes, now battle-hardened and adapted for tropical warfare, would lead the effort. At first light, 12 Hurricanes of No. 28 Squadron roared down the river valleys, their Merlin engines slicing through the humid air. Each plane carried a mixed load: bombs for structures, rockets for vehicles, and a full complement of 303 and 20 mm cannons. Pilots had memorized the terrain, noting river bends, treetop clearings, and previously spotted ambush points. Precision was crucial. The margin for error was negligible. The first strike targeted a Japanese supply depot at Miyachina. Hurricanes dove in steep arcs, releasing bombs that ripped through ammunition stores. Fires spread rapidly, and explosions shook the jungle canopy. Strafing runs shredded fuel trucks and immobilized armored vehicles. Enemy soldiers scattered in confusion, many caught in the open between trees, unprotected against the Hurricane's withering firepower. Japanese anti-aircraft fire intensified, yet the Hurricane's speed, dive angles, and formation discipline minimized losses. Flight Sergeant James Whitaker later described the scene. "We could see men running, smoke everywhere, and the river reflecting the flashes of explosions. There was no time for hesitation. 1 second too long and you were gone." 2 aircraft sustained damage, but pilots returned with engines smoking, further testifying to the Hurricane's durability. The second wave, coordinated with infantry advances. Forward observers marked enemy troop concentrations, allowing Hurricanes to target the most vulnerable positions. Villages used as field hospitals or command posts were struck with precision, disrupting enemy communications and command structures. Within hours, previously entrenched positions were abandoned. Japanese forces, caught between relentless airstrikes and advancing ground troops, began a disorganized retreat. By mid-afternoon, the campaign had escalated into a relentless series of strikes. Along multiple river valleys, Hurricanes became instruments of psychological warfare. The low hum of their engines carried an unmistakable warning. Supply columns slowed, bridges were destroyed, and forward positions fell. The enemy's mobility, previously a core strength, was shattered. Commanders recognized the turning point immediately. Air Vice Marshal Pierce reported, "The coordinated actions of our Hurricane squadrons have resulted in the near total disruption of enemy supply lines in the northern Irrawaddy sector. Ground advances are now feasible where previously impassable terrain and fortified positions prevented progress." Casualty reports confirmed the effectiveness. Japanese troop numbers were reduced not only by direct strikes, but by abandonment of critical supplies and forced retreats. Hurricanes had imposed a toll far beyond what their numbers suggested, demonstrating the strategic impact of small, well-coordinated air units in a theater previously considered secondary. The human cost, however, was evident. Pilots faced exhaustion, tropical illness, and constant threat of mechanical failure. Mechanics labored day and night to keep engines functional, yet the payoff, the liberation of supply routes, the softening of enemy defenses, and the restored momentum of the 14th Army validated every sacrifice. By the end of April 1944, Hurricanes had effectively rewritten the dynamics of the Eastern Theater, where months prior, Allied forces had been on the defensive. The skies now belonged to them. Japanese mobility was curtailed, strategic positions compromised, and morale among Allied troops soared. Hurricanes had achieved what European theaters might have deemed improbable: the transformation of an outdated fighter into the spearhead of a critical offensive. The result was not dramatic in newspapers or celebrated in propaganda. It was methodical, relentless, and devastatingly effective. It was a silent revenge, fought not for spectacle, but for survival. Strategy and duty, the Hurricanes had risen again, asserting their presence in the East and altering the course of the campaign with precision, courage, and persistence. The smoke had barely cleared over the Irrawaddy when reports began filtering back from the front lines. Bridges were shattered, river crossings unusable, and Japanese supply convoys decimated. Intelligence officers estimated that over 60% of enemy stores in the northern sector had been destroyed or abandoned for months. The Hurricanes had been building toward this moment, and the impact was tangible. Allied ground forces advanced with unprecedented speed. Villages and hilltops, previously contested, were now occupied without major resistance. Soldiers spoke of the psychological weight carried by the low, droning roar of Hurricane engines. Where once Japanese units had felt secure beneath the jungle canopy, they now faced sudden, inescapable aerial punishment. Commanders of the 14th Army noted the operational shift. Air superiority is now absolute in key sectors, enabling ground movements previously impossible. RAF squadrons, though battered by constant sorties, demonstrated resilience. Hurricanes returned with minor damage in many cases, proof of their durability and the skill of the pilots, engineers, and mechanics. Working in makeshift workshops along muddy strips, salvaged parts from damaged aircraft to maintain operational strength. Their ingenuity ensured the relentless pace of operations could continue despite tropical conditions and extended supply lines. The Japanese, by contrast, faced disarray. Troop movements slowed, supply chains collapsed, and morale deteriorated. Retreats became uncoordinated. Fuel shortages left units stranded, and forward positions were abandoned without engagement. Some commanders attempted to regroup and launch counterattacks, but the disruption caused by sustained airstrikes meant these efforts were piecemeal and largely ineffective. The campaign's success also resonated beyond the battlefield. Reports from Delhi and Calcutta noted a boost in confidence among military planners and local populations. British and Indian troops had witnessed firsthand the strategic power of air-ground integration. The Hurricanes' actions proved that even older aircraft, when deployed effectively, could decisively influence a theater of war. Operational planning for subsequent missions shifted. Commanders now prioritized rapid strikes against supply lines, bridges, and fortified positions. Leveraging Hurricanes' durability and firepower, forward airfields became central hubs for sustained pressure. Supporting multiple sorties per day, coordination with ground troops improved, marking a new phase in the integration of air and land campaigns. Casualties, though significant, were mitigated by tactical adaptations. Pilots flew in small formations, staggering sorties to reduce vulnerability. Low-level strikes, once high-risk maneuvers, became controlled exercises thanks to reconnaissance, jungle observation, and careful timing. Hurricanes proved capable of delivering decisive effects while maintaining a sustainable operational tempo. Reports sent back to London painted a narrative of understated triumph. The Eastern Theater, often dismissed as secondary, had demonstrated the strategic value of improvisation, resilience, and effective leadership. The Hurricanes, once considered outdated, had reclaimed relevance, proving that their contribution could alter the course of operations in a major campaign. By the end of Part 1 of the aftermath, it was clear the Hurricanes' campaign in Burma had shifted the balance of power. Japanese positions were weakened, Allied forces were emboldened, and the foundation was laid for continued advances into previously contested territory. Yet the full scope of the consequences, the operational, psychological, and strategic aftermath, would unfold in the coming months, setting the stage for a more comprehensive reckoning. As May 1944 approached, the full impact of the hurricane strikes became evident. Japanese forces, stretched thin and logistically crippled, struggled to regroup. Supply shortages forced a recalibration of defensive lines. Many units were withdrawn to consolidate around more secure positions. The psychological toll was equally severe. Soldiers reported fear of low-level air attacks long before any engagement, a testament to the hurricane's new role as a persistent, inescapable presence. Allied casualty figures, by contrast, remained comparatively low. Hurricane's tactical evolution, precision strikes, coordinated reconnaissance, and careful sortie planning minimized exposure while maximizing impact. Losses among pilots were real but sustainable, and the aircraft themselves proved remarkably durable. Even planes with substantial damage often returned to base, thanks to rugged construction and the ingenuity of maintenance crews. The campaign also catalyzed innovation in tropical warfare. Hurricanes were now routinely equipped with rockets for anti-vehicle operations, and bombing runs were optimized for maximum disruption of jungle supply lines. Forward airstrips, once makeshift, became hubs of operational efficiency. Air-ground coordination was formalized, ensuring that each sortie directly supported infantry objectives. This integration represented a tactical evolution that would influence Allied operations throughout the Southeast Asian theater. Strategically, the hurricane's effectiveness reshaped Japanese defensive planning. Convoys were rerouted, bridges reinforced or abandoned, and positions camouflaged more rigorously. Yet these measures could not fully counter the sustained pressure. The Allied air campaign had shifted the initiative, forcing Japanese commanders into reactive operations. Mobility, a cornerstone of their doctrine, was constrained. The RAF's ability to strike deep behind enemy lines effectively dictated the tempo of the conflict. The psychological effect extended beyond the battlefield. Pilots, crews, and ground forces recognized that their actions had a tangible impact on the broader war effort. Newspapers and dispatches in India, while limited in detail, hinted at the importance of the air campaign for the men in the Hurricanes. The sense of purpose, of finally achieving a measure of revenge against an advancing enemy, bolstered morale and reinforced the value of perseverance under extreme conditions. Casualty and destruction reports provide a stark picture. Japanese troop losses were compounded by abandoned equipment, destroyed supply depots, and disrupted communications. Entire regiments were immobilized or forced into piecemeal retreat. Meanwhile, the Allies gained both ground and confidence terrain previously inaccessible due to Japanese control became strategically exploitable, setting the stage for further advances towards central Burma. Historians have noted the lasting impact of these operations. The Hurricanes campaign demonstrated the enduring value of adaptable, resilient aircraft in irregular theaters. The lessons learned in Burma: precision, coordination, improvisation under adverse conditions, informed later air-ground campaigns, including those in Malaya and the reconquest of Southeast Asian islands. The campaign underscored that even older designs, when employed intelligently and persistently, could decisively alter outcomes. By the end of the aftermath phase, The narrative of the Eastern Theater had shifted. Hurricanes had moved from defensive, supportive roles to being central to strategic operations. Japanese forces were compelled into defensive, reactive postures. Allied ground forces enjoyed unprecedented mobility, and the operational model of integrating air and ground power under challenging environmental conditions had proven its effectiveness. The Hurricane's rise was no longer a story of forgotten aircraft, but of enduring ingenuity, resilience, and tactical mastery. They had exacted a quiet but undeniable revenge, leaving an indelible mark on the Burma campaign, one that would echo in subsequent operations and in the lessons of air warfare in tropical theaters. The skies above Burma had long been silent, save for the monsoon winds and the distant rumble of river currents. Yet, for a brief but decisive period, the low, insistent roar of hurricanes transformed the jungle into a theater of endurance, ingenuity, and subtle vengeance. These aircraft, once considered obsolete, became instruments not of spectacle, but of survival and strategic precision. History often remembers great battles for their drama, the Blitz of Stalingrad, the storming of Normandy, but the story of the hurricanes in Burma reminds us that war is equally shaped by quiet persistence, adaptation, and the courage to confront adversity in overlooked places. Pilots who had faced Europe's skies returned thousands of miles from home to confront a new enemy in a new climate, learning again how to fight, improvise, and endure. Mechanics, engineers, and support crews labored in mud and monsoon rain, keeping fragile engines alive and turning every damaged aircraft into a weapon of possibility. The campaign underscores the interplay between human determination, technological adaptation, and tactical innovation. Hurricanes survived the tropical storms not merely because of steel and engines, but because of the men and women who understood their strengths, patched their weaknesses, and exploited them with relentless discipline. Leadership, coordination with ground forces, and the ability to read both terrain and enemy intent transformed a forgotten fighter into a decisive instrument of war. Yet beyond strategy and statistics, there's a quieter legacy. The campaign illustrates the moral dimension of warfare, that resilience, ingenuity, and courage in the face of neglect or adversity can reclaim initiative, restore confidence, and shape history in ways that are often uncelebrated. The Hurricane's revenge was neither vengeful nor theatrical. It was measured, deliberate, and profound, carried out in a theater distant from headlines, but no less consequential. When the monsoon returned and the jungles reclaimed the airstrips, the hurricanes remained symbols of endurance. They had proven that even in the harshest conditions, purpose, adaptability, and quiet determination could tip the balance of battle in the broader sweep of World War II. Their story reminds us that history is shaped not only by the famous victories, but by those moments of persistence, innovation, and courage that, though overlooked, made all the difference. The hurricanes rose again, and in their hum over the eastern jungles, they carried a story of redemption, skill, and the enduring human will to fight.